What's up, guys? Who needs meta here with Cadigan, who got top 24 at RBET04 with Prisma Box. Dark Calling, it doesn't have an official name, but we're kind of going to do an in-depth rundown of the deck and what we played, what we chose not to play, and stuff like that. So, and then maybe the deck going forward, and eventually we'll reprofile this with a bit more optimization. The community seems to be kind of driving to push this deck a little bit farther forward. So without further ado, I'm going to let Cadigan, take over.
Yeah, I was actually really kind of amazed that the deck did decently, and not even just mine. There was Tristan and Kazaris who did well, and Tristan even tying with me with 17th place. We'll include a link to his list in the profile, but to get into the heart and soul of whatever you want to call this deck, it's not Gaia Turbo like it is on the Edison Discord. We're trying to figure out what to rebrand it as. Stratos isn't the heart and soul of it, but it searches it, which is Prisma. Only two. It's really, we want to call the deck Prisma Box because the whole fusion functionality of the deck comes from this card. It's essentially the same kind of pressuring monster as far as Grepher goes. You want this card to stay on the field to continue to get value out of it, turn in, turn out. You don't have to worry about discarding, though, so it is even more threatening in that regard. You're hindered in this format because it doesn't send from deck for cost until later. So if you try to on-summon, declare priority, pitch the fusion material from your deck, and they have a response that removes it from the field or puts it face down, it won't resolve properly. So it's a bit more fragile, but the strategy exists. It's a level 4 warrior, E-hero, search a bunch of ways, fill up your graveyard with fusion materials. Lots of fun.
But you brick 3.
Yeah, you brick 3. So you don't include 3. You can, but you'll see it more often than you want. To go with the hero package, we have Ocean and Alius. Ocean is there as a dumpable water for Prisma, primarily. You don't really run quite enough back row to capitalize on the standby phase recursion.
Unless you flip return.
Unless you flip return, yeah. That's definitely something you can do. But on average, you're mainly using it as a dumpable water. Alius is there both as a searchable beater for certain matchups and for certain extra deck choices for fusion.
Divine Neos!
Yeah, for Divine Neos with future fusion, which you can kind of basically do a 5-head dragon, dump 5 heroes with. But
you don't get nearly as cool of a monster, though.
No, you just set up like 2 fusion spells with it.
It's not a win button, unfortunately.
Going into the evil hero side of things, we have 2 Malicious Edge. Not Malicious Fiend, that's the extra deck one. Malicious Edge, level 7 Fiend monster. You contribute it with 1 tribute if your opponent controls a monster. It does piercing. It's a surprisingly relevant normal summon on occasion, especially with me having opted to run 2 Infernal Prodigy with it. It's actually a decent going second play if you just plop out a Prodigy and then tribute it for a Malicious Edge. You get a 1 tribute, 2600 beater, and at the end of the turn you draw a card. So, frankly, it could be worse. But mainly, these cards are in here to, again, pitch with Prisma, and these Prodigies are in here to synergize with it and the Caiuses you'll see later. You're just trying to patch together a few different pieces of synergy to make a cohesive strategy. Going on to additional Prisma dump targets that have additional synergies in the deck, we have Grand Mole, which is both a decent monster on its own. It, on its own, won me a few games just by being really annoying with your opponent setting monsters.
It's good against Goblin Zombie and Raikou because the monster doesn't flip.
Yeah. So it was surprisingly relevant on its own in addition to being a Prismable rock monster. Speaking of Prismable rock monster, we have Big Piece Golem.
This card rocks.
It's literally just a 2100 level 5 rock monster, but you can normal it if your opponent controls a monster and you don't. Again, it's kind of like a half-decent normal summon, especially against all the Blackwing players that I end up facing.
Our Gladiator Beasts.
Yeah, it's just a Chungus that's relevant. And lastly, for Prisma dump targets, Cyber Dragon. It's mainly in there both to support your tribute package, be a general decent beater, but also if you happen to run against either Ancient Gears or Gadgets or any other machine strategy, or your opponent just has Card Trooper or Catastor on field, you can Prisma send this in contact with your Prisma that's considered Cyber Dragon now. So it's a main deck. It's kind of pre-board, but it also works with your main deck strategy.
Because you could use it as tribute fodder, And it works again because none of your fusions are darks. So it works.
No.
Getting rid of Catastor is actually relevant because the two main evil hero fusions aren't dark. They just look dark, but they're not.
Yeah, they do. And everyone's
Like
always
Malicious
confused
Edge
when
isn't
they're
dark
not.
either. That's why we're not running Allure.
If only you could run Greffers, and it would probably be better than Prisma if they were all dark, but they're not. Going on to the rest of the main deck cards. Again, Tribute, fodder, plus General Disruption, plus Miracle Fusion, fodder. We have 2 Snowman Eaters. These were amazing all day. Whenever I was able to see one, I felt much more confident being able to hold the line, feeling more confident drawing Miracle Fusions later on. I pretty much never felt bad seeing this card unless it was the 6th monster in my hand. I don't have much more to say than that, other than it was extremely relevant, again, against all the Blackwing players I faced and everyone else.
Because you can play around Dick Attack by just setting it.
Yeah.
And so it's a safety thing.
Second to last monsters, Triple Caius. 1, you run a lot of tribute support, so Caius is great. But 2, it's a level 6 Fiend, which is relevant for your fusions.
Both of them.
It supports both fusions. It's got decent attack stat for Dark Gaia, and it's a level 6 for Malicious Fiend, in addition to Caius just being Caius, right? Not much more to say than that. I resolved this a lot against Blackwings, against zombies, Infernal Prodigy helping out, Snowman Eater helping out.
And the fact that you have Miracle Fusion with water means you can do the Caius Ab-Zero dumb stuff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I did do that at least once. And last to round out the monster lineup is Gorz, again, because Gorz is good, but also because it can go into either fusion as material as well. So I'm going to move on to the spell lineup at the moment. And after I go through the main deck, I'll go back through and kind of pull out cards that didn't quite jive throughout the day. And then we'll go again into what I think the deck could look like going forward. So the first spell, the one that this deck was initially named after, Dark Calling. This is very similar to Miracle Fusion in that it banishes from grave, but instead of on field like Miracle Fusion, it's hand. So hand and grave you can banish from, which is very relevant, especially if your big Fiend monsters or even your big rock get stuck in hand and you can't get them onto the field. You don't have to. You can banish from hand. Yeah, it's neg to do so, but if it wins you the game, that's pretty plus to me. But it really is just as simple as Miracle Fusion. You can use the hand. Speaking of Miracle Fusion, I only ran 2. That being because I didn't want to run a second Prismable water. Ocean was already bricky enough as is as a Garnet in this deck, basically. You did have another option in Aqua Dolphin, which I'll show later, Neo-Spacian Aqua Dolphin. But to me, that card also felt like a Garnet that wasn't worth running. I tried to design this deck to function with or without being able to fusion, expecting a lot of things like Royal Oppression and Icarus Attack. I overall don't regret the decision, not with my build anyway. If you wanted to run more Miracle Fusions, I think you'd need to run more Waters or more dumpable Waters. Other fusion card, Future Fusion.
Yeah, so 6 fusion cards total. Obviously, This is the DB algorithm's best friend.
I was really lucky opening this card a lot in my early games in match 1 and 2, and then hardly saw it past then when it was relevant. But good card is good. Set up Ab-Zero, set up Divine Neos, fun stuff. And then just for consistency with the deck, you've got Rhoda, and then you definitely abuse all 3 E-Calls in a deck like this. There's legitimate consideration to dropping one of those out.
We've been experimenting with 2.
You can definitely end up going through all of your searches and then still end up living long enough to draw one of these when you don't want to. But I would say the majority of the time, just getting the higher chance to see one of these early on to set up either Prisma or Stratos is worth the brick. But
in turn 1, we've noticed that you don't always want to go straight for Stratos if you open one of those. If you have one of the fusions in hand, it's more worth it to, especially if you're going first or your opponent doesn't have back row, to start that Prisma early, get half of a fusion in there already, because you don't necessarily know if you're going to get the other half.
That's exactly right. Getting the tempo of getting a brick out of deck, especially if you can protect the Prisma, and especially if you have 2 searches, if you have 2 E-Calls or E-Call Rhoda, it's almost always correct to go Prisma first, especially if the rest of your hand is spells. You want to save the Stratos for, in case you draw Malicious Edge, you can then Stratos for Infernal Prodigy to try to unbrick. So it's pretty good utility. Staple spells, Brain Con, you have, 7 technical tributes? You've got 3 Caius, you've got Cyber Dragon, Big Piece, and then the two Malicious. Technically Gorz, but you don't run any tuners, so up to you. I think some people did opt to end up cutting it, but I think it's worth it.
Brain Caius is so good.
Brain Caius, I did that at least a few times, or even Brain Mally Edge is decent. I opted for 1 book, and I'll get into this a little bit more when I get into the trap lineup, but I wanted another reactive card that wasn't purple that I could activate on the turn I got it, expecting things like Vanity's Fiends or being afraid to bonk into an Honest or a Kalut. I could go to 0 on this. I could go up to 2. It really depends on what the meta's doing. Then we got Heavy Storm and MST to run out the staple trap, the staple spell lineup. And I'll talk about this again after the fact, but Giant Trunade is a possible consideration also. For those wondering if this is the style of deck to use it, you can tailor it that way. Trap cards. Win button.
Kind of.
Yeah, sort of. It can brick. None of your cards inherently banish themselves, and you have to rely on at least one of your fusions resolving in order to get value out of this card, or, if your opponent, deprisoned or bottomless a bunch of your cards, sure. But as far as how
Caius it or something like that, it naturally, as the game goes on, it gets better. And if you do play triple miracle, triple calling, it's better.
Yeah, it gets better with each banish fusion you run. It's worth even the potential brick just because you really can put out 2 to 5 monsters with base 1700 up to 26 or greater attack, and just OTK that way, or get Stratos back to pop a bunch of cards, or get a Prisma back to dump cards.
That is another thing, yeah. If you're thinking about which fusion you want to use for where one of your hero guys, if you have a Prisma or a Stratos banished, since we're not playing Call, it makes more sense to banish the Stratos as opposed to the Prisma, because if you flip Return as Chainlink 1, you can pop a whole bunch of back row if you bring back a bunch of hero guys.
Yeah. There's a lot of niche interactions like that end up mattering in the course of a longer tournament, like RBET, for example. Other cards, I wanted one more piece of back row disruption, and I didn't want it to be Trunade. I didn't think I was quite aggressive enough, with cards like Snowman Eater and Grand Mole. Couldn't always close out games once you flip Trunade. So Dust Tornado, I slotted in, actually performed very well. It was very relevant to have another quote-unquote MST for sniping set Icarus attacks or just being chainable in general to back row removal. It was great. In the theme of protecting the castle, aka Prisma, I ran 2 Bottomless. I ran 2 D-Prison, and a Mirror Force. Frankly, D-Prison performed above what I thought it would. It was relevant each time I drew it.
I think it's better than Bottomless if you're going to go with one of them.
Yeah, right now at least.
Or 1-1.
With all the... I say with all the Blackwing players, that could change, in the next week, the next month. But D-Prison performed very well for me during the tournament. Normally preserving my Prisma or outing a very valuable monster like an Armed Wing for value, or a Shura that was about to get value off of a Prisma. And I'll just round it out with Judgment. Not much to say about Judgment, except it says no. It's great to do that in a combo deck. That was the main board. I will get into the extra deck at the moment, and before I do, I'll mention maybe some notable exclusions from the main board that you may have noticed. That being... So notable exclusions being Torrential and Dust Shoot. I don't think excluding Torrential is that foreign of a concept. Blackwing players don't do it because they need to preserve their board. I opted not to run it for the same reason. You really need to win by sticking your big fusion monsters, not by clearing them. You can argue that you can try to support, their setup by using this card. In testing, I didn't think it was worth it. I didn't really feel like I missed it. Dust Shoot also, every card in this deck needs to be live, and in testing, I just found Dust Shoot wasn't consistent enough in doing that. You can use it to protect your cards by hitting like a Caius or a bigger monster than your Prisma or whatever. But ultimately, I'd rather just run direct removal like Deep Prison or something that would threaten that. So those are my reasons for not including those cards. And before I get into the extra deck, I'll talk about cards that maybe underperformed or could just be cut in general. So the third Caius and second Infernal Prodigy, I feel, are probably flex slots. I think 2 Caius is the minimum, but I don't think 3 Caius is required. And if you're going to drop the third Caius, I would definitely recommend dropping the second Infernal Prodigy, especially if you opt to run cards like Snowman Eater like I did. They just clog in hand. You normally only get to resolve 1 Infernal Prodigy anyways, and I found that the second was in my hand when I lost a few times. Book of Moon, it's a decent card, but I think it could be any card that is also decent in protecting your monsters, or it could even be back row removal. And we talked about it a little bit earlier, but the third Emergency Call, it helps with redundancy for searching, but it can brick, and that brick can cost you the game. So if you try this out, don't feel bad about cutting the third E-Call. It's definitely not required. 2 and 1 Rhoda is almost certainly required. The third is not. So to get into the extra deck then, the fun stuff, I'll introduce the...
Extra deck. It's the fusion deck, sir.
Yeah, in this deck, it is entirely the fusion deck. I'll introduce the 2 Evil Hero fusions. So, Evil Hero Dark Gaia is... Both of these you can only summon with their respective fuel spell or Dark Calling. So you can't call or return them back just like most of the Elemental Hero fusions. Dark Gaia you form with a Rock and a Fiend, which is why you run Prisma targets like Big Piece Golem and Grenmol, and Evil Hero Malicious Edge to dump cards like that. It blanks flip effect monsters. When it attacks, it flips them face up. Flip effects aren't activated, which is really good against all the Rykos, the Hamsters, the Dandy tokens, whatever else that's just floating around, hamsters.
It'll make people not put Treeborn Frog out there, maybe.
Yeah, it can pressure them to not do that. This card by itself, unfortunately, doesn't out the dupe lock, but if they have dupe sub, then it does still do 4,600 because it flips their dupe into attack and you can still ram it. It's a great card at applying pressure. This card gets huge. Your typical combo of dumping Big Piece and Malicious Edge gets this to 4,700 attack, which is a game ending or really accelerates the clock. Fantastic pressure. This is normally the one you go for first, but it's a great card. Malicious Fiend is good on paper, but is weaker and can also be abused a bit by your opponent, in that when it's your opponent's battle phase, anything they have set flips up. So they can set Rykos, they can set Snowman Eaters, they can set Fossil Dinos and abuse that. But if they can't respond like that, they can't attack anything but it. So if you're able to get this on the field and have something valuable like a Prisma, like a Fossil Dino, it's a valuable castle at that point. The one thing I was glad to see, or not see, was Book of Moon. That totally blanks Dark Gaia. It'll set it, you'll flip it back up, it'll have 0 attack, it'll basically be worthless at that point.
Outside of being used as more fusion material.
Yeah.
It's kind of like stacking Ab Zeros. You could do the same thing with these guys because they're both Fiends.
Correct.
And level 6 or higher, so.
That's the intro to the fun Evil Hero guys.
And you don't need 3 of either.
No, you don't. I initially had 3 Malicious Fiend in there, and it was completely unnecessary. Getting into the usual suspects in hero decks, triple Ab Zero, even with only 2 Miracle, you can still get the third out there with Feature Fusion, which you go for most of the time.
Because if you draw like 1 Neo-Spacian or the Alias, because you only play 1 Neo-Spacian, 2 you draw.
Yeah, I'll go into the combo with Divine Neos here shortly, but good card is good. If you can run it, you should. Because Malicious Fiend and Malicious Edge and Dark Gaia are Earths, I do opt to run 2 Gaia. It's literally filler. Your extra deck is all fusions. It's not worth it to put 1 monster in there. You could maybe cut one of these for a Stardust if you opt to run Starlight Road. It's definitely the most flexible spot in the extra deck, but it's technically possible to make. I only think I made 1 Gaia once or twice throughout the day. Getting into cards that you can technically fuse into still before they're just there for Prisma. Double Chimera Tech. The Prisma Cyber Dragon interaction is very strong. Because of this, this deck has a very favorable machine matchup. Whether it's Ancient Gears or Gadgets, Machino, whatever you want to call it. You essentially have, like 7 or 8 Cyber Dragons on call at any time. So it's phenomenal. You just need to be stingy about when you use it, I guess. Don't just use it for one gadget. Going into the card, Divine Neos himself, the meme. This was actually a pretty recent addition to the deck, maybe within the last 2 or 3 weeks of testing. The Discord channel was really starting to pick up as far as who was interested in this. And I can't remember, I totally forget who actually brought up Divine Neos. But as soon as it was brought up, it was immediately like, this is basically just 5-head for us. The fusion itself isn't that great. You can basically banish any type of hero from your graveyard. It gains 500 attack, and then it copies its effects. You don't have that many good targets. But you reveal it so that you can send an Earth Rock, a Earth Fiend, Neos, Alius, which really isn't. I mean, it's there. It's required. And then Ocean, and then you can either choose at that point to send an Infernal Prodigy because it's a hero, or the second Malicious Edge if you have a bunch of Dark Callings and need to get those out of there. So just for example, just by Future Fusion for Divine Neos, you immediately have a live Miracle and a live Dark Calling, and then you can get technically halfway to another one of either, because that's a hero. So if your first Ab-Zero gets bonked, either one of these can turn it into another one with Miracle. I typically only went for it if I had multiple fusions in hand. If I just had one, I would typically just go for reveal Ab-Zero, and you cannot reveal any of the evil hero fusions. They can only be special summoned with their Dark Fusion card or Dark Calling because it lists it, so you can't even reveal them for it. So that's why you can't do that and set it up more easily that way. And for the Prisma targets, we've got Multiple Piece Golem, which you use to send Big Piece. We've got Grand Neos to send Grand Mole, and Terra Firma to send the Ocean. So to get into the side deck, to no one's surprise, DD Crow, put it in there just as a generic answer to so many things. It was. Although I literally played 3 Blackwing players in the 6 rounds I played, so I didn't bring it in against them. They were all pure Blackwing. They're not hybrid. They weren't Vayu. So I left it out, but I did bring it in against zombies, and at least one other matchup. It was good. It's like everything else.
It's the most side decked card.
Yeah, it's just good. It's a good card. Fossil Dyna, you can either use Fossil Dynas or Vanity's Fiends. And it depends on your mentality for using them. Funny enough, they're both fusion materials. This is a rock. Vanity's Fiend is a level 6 or higher fiend. So they have that dual synergy. And you do run a lot of tribute fodder, so you can run Vanities. I opted to not need the tribute fodder to get my special summon denier on the field, but it's a viable choice to go either way. Beyond that, I opted for Thunder King at first, just because it was a kind of a trigger reaction to me expecting more Dragon Turbo players, and this card is somewhat decent against them. It ended up just being a good 1900 beater that shut down some decks. It's relevant against Blackwings. It's good to chunk Goblin Zombie with or stop their Brio pushes. So it came in handy. It wasn't my most cited card, but it also wasn't my least. And then the last Cyber Dragon for the monsters. You can bring it in against machines, bring it in against anything that can't deal with a 2100 beater.
Bring it in going second.
Yeah, bring it in going second. It's a versatile card. As far as spells, only cited 2. 1 Smashing Ground and 1 Lightning Vortex. These were to deal with monsters that prevented us from doing things like Vanities, like Fossil Dyna, or trying to clear big established boards like Dragons. They came in. I didn't really see them much, or not when I needed them, so I can't really speak to how they actually performed in tournament, but the Therio is there. Just good cards are good. You don't really mind discarding sometimes. If it's a fusion material, it's basically free.
You're gonna get stuck with that Malicious Edges at some point.
Yeah, it's gonna happen.
It's inevitable.
Going into the traps, you definitely need to pack more back row disruption for the back row heavy decks, especially with how many decks were running Oppression. Dust Tornado was great for outing that. I don't have much more to say than that. Good card is good. I expected more Diva decks, frankly, whether it's Hero or Frog or anything of that sort. So I put in Rugs. They didn't really come up. I think I sided them in my very last round of the day against a Frog Narc player. They would have been great if I saw them in time. Didn't end up mattering, but in theory, they're decent.
Which you needed to see with the 2 spells.
Yeah, I did. They weren't there.
Vanity's Fiend.
And Threatening Roars. This was in expectation of more Dragon Turbo and Zombie players. Both of those decks can really just push OTK boards out of nowhere while trying to clear your back row in the process. I felt this was a great response, both to keep your monsters alive and to stop yourself from dying, and then giving yourself a turn to recuperate. It didn't end up mattering too much. At some point, somebody dusted a Threatening Roar, and it felt great. I can't say if it won me the game or not. Ethereal is there. It could maybe be a more impactful card.
It protects Prisma.
Yeah, it protects Prisma and keeps you alive. So I can go into some of the cards that I think could make it into the deck going forward, whether in the main deck or the side. At the moment, I'm going to talk about what could go into the main deck in the future, whether in place of the 4 cards that I called out earlier or any other configuration that you want. So of discussion to me at the moment is whether or not to put in Morphine Jar. It's a rock, but beyond that, it helps you dump all of your fusion bricks and draw all of your fusions. At the cost of giving your opponent potentially the same setup, but I believe this deck typically has the edge as far as how quickly it can push damage against some of those decks, especially if when you discard their hand, they discard their outs. They can't redraw outs that they don't have multiple copies of. So the Therio is there, still in testing. Feel free to try it out. I think it's probably one of the more solid directions to take the deck. Aqua Dolphin.
An option for the second Snowman.
Yeah, if you, in my build at least, if you want to run 3 Miracle Fusion, you probably need to sub out a Snowman Eater for an Aqua Dolphin. You need at least a second Prismable Water in order to just reliably resolve Miracle Fusion.
So you need the fusion that would go with it instead of the second Gaia.
And this is probably more worth it than Second Ocean. At least the discard effect on Aqua Dolphin is relevant to set up your grave. And if you have another monster on field, like Cyber Dragon and then this, that's a good combo. If you're able to fusion and then do this, you can take anything out of their hand. So the Therio is there. I hated the concept of drawing a 600 vanilla in a top decking situation. I'd much rather draw a Snowman Eater, but it's there. Especially if you run cards to protect yourself, maybe discard traps. Another option is Card Trooper, and possibly also the Raikou package. I really don't like the random milling aspect of trying this strategy.
But it draws.
More often than not, you're going to mill your fusion spells along with your fusion materials. But you can still, it's a sack card. You can sack them by milling 1 or 2 fusion materials and nothing else relevant, and then they kill it and you draw a card.
High roll, baby.
So if you're trying to include a little more variance in your your risk reward, go for it. And also a card that I only cut recently from the main, but I'm considering putting it back, is Tragodia. At 1, I mean, it's just a decent card, stops you from dying, but again, it's also a high-level Fiend that you can use for Malicious Fiend, but it's got 0 attack, so it's not good for Dark Gaia. It's viable. You also have a very wide level spread that is somewhat searchable. Just with E-Call and Stratos, you can search a level 4, a level 7, a level 2, and you run level 3s and level 5s and even 6s, so there's a lot of utility with it. It's viable. I opted to not include it because I found my hand size to be consistently pretty low.
Which is why we're considering Morphing Jar.
Yeah. So in anything other than the early game, you don't want to see this very often, but for your consideration.
Thankfully, because you have 5 fusion spells, you'll typically win a top deck war.
Yeah, that is, I guess that's like kind of the unspoken part of why this deck is as fun as it is you can just dump all your fusion materials. You can have good cards like Bottomless Deprison or just Caius to advance your game state normally, and then as you start whittling your opponent down, you top deck into just bomb fusion spells and clear them out. Other possible main deck inclusions,
That over the... Oh, yeah.
A very viable one is Upstart Goblin. Those 4 cards that I showed earlier in my build, I'm personally thinking of swapping them out for 3 Upstarts and a Morphing Jar. Just because I think it's worth cutting a few meaningful cards to get to your more powerful cards more quickly. Do the 1,000 life points or more matter? Sometimes, but in practice, I think it operates more like Vayu Turbo, as far as, yes, Greffer Armed Wing is 4K and puts somebody on a 2-turn clock, but that almost never actually happens. And Dark Gaia specifically gets so big that you can kind of invalidate the 1,000 or so. If you give them 2 or more, it sometimes matters. But in general, I think seeing your value cards more frequently is worth the life points costs, but it is to be tested. In a similar vein to increasing the consistency of your strategy, that being just beating people's faces in with purple fusion cards, Giant Trunade just clears back row.
Or Trap Stun.
Yeah. Or Trap Stun, which I will. It's right here. At one point, I did have a Trap Stun in the main board. I swapped it first with Trunade and then with Dust Tornado, purely because I expected things like Royal Oppression or feared cards like Necro Valley or Zombie World or D-Fissure that Trap Stun doesn't solve, or at least doesn't solve permanently. But it's definitely worth considering. And on to the remaining traps that I've considered in the main board. Call was in the deck up until literally the day before the tournament when I swapped it with a book. I wanted a more consistent card. Essentially, Call is great. You can Prisma a 2600 beater if you need it. You can Prisma a Grand Mold, bounce it back to your hand, and reuse it if you want. Ultimately, I found that Call makes your brickier hands worse and makes your good hands better. And I wanted to try to narrow that gap. I wanted to make it more consistent, so I opted to cut it. Protection, you could have Starlight Road, or you can opt to run the discard traps. I know Tristan's deck, I believe, did run 2 Raigeki breaks. And whether or not you want Break or Wing Blast in this deck is up for debate. Putting them back in tempo is very valid. But at the same time, for the same reasons as I wanted Dust, Break answers some of those cards that you can't deal with rather than putting them back on the top of their deck, especially if you're kind of just in a top decking war. You don't want them to top deck the out that you can't solve. So
that, and there are situations where you can, like, Break clearing the out is important because, yeah, Wing Blasting a dead card into a fusion is really good, and them just losing that turn and your fusion having that extra turn of getting in there. But at the same time, there are instances where you're going to want to use one of the discard traps and you don't have a fusion, and all you want to do is sack for Caius or something like that, and then that tempo isn't really that important.
Yeah, I had 2 Wing Blasts in my very original build. I cut them because I found myself discarding real cards too often, in addition to those aforementioned reasons. But try it out; it's viable. Lastly, Mind Crush. I don't think you should main Mind Crush unless you are running Aqua Dolphin or the Dust Shoot, or preferably probably both. But it's a viable strategy. Carpath tried it with his Neo-Spacian Diva Hero list that he took to the really big charity tournament to some success. You could emulate a similar strategy here. You could try to do the same thing. Words are hard.
There's the one deck that's version of this build that revolves around triple Aqua Dolphin.
After the tournament, we started brainstorming weird ways to try to push this deck. One way was running 5 Neo-Spacians and Convert Contact, which works because it sets up half of both fusions. If you send Aqua Dolphin and Grand Mole, that's half a Dark Calling and half of a Miracle Fusion. Ultimately, I don't like it. It increases your bricks and doesn't by itself make a fusion live. But it's viable. You draw cards, you thin your deck. In theory, what more do you want? Side deck cards.
That we didn't play.
Jiu-Jitsu Master and Vanity's Fiend are the 2 monsters I'll highlight here. Jiu-Jitsu Master, I don't know that you would want to run Dyna and Master. You probably could. They do luckily both have the same rock synergy, which is great. It depends on what you're expecting. Jiu-Jitsu Master is better against things like Black Wings and Glad Beasts. Fossil Dyna's better against things like Vayu. So it all depends. Vanity's Fiend is a very valid inclusion. Again, you run enough Tribute Fighter to get it out consistently. Some decks can't deal with special negate that they can't run over with a normal summon.
The mirror.
Yeah. Also, it blanks the mirror really hard, unless you have the outs. But you don't search anything that gets rid of that.
Just draw the out.
Yeah, just draw the out. So very viable inclusions that you should think about including in your side deck for the aforementioned synergies and just good card strategies. David was really keen on replacing the Smashing Ground and Lightning Vortex in the sides with Soul Takers.
It outs the dupe lock. It causes it to miss timing. It causes other cards to miss timing. You don't have to worry about...
It's targeted too, so Smashing Ground on the off chance that they have like vanities up and then they have something with a bigger butt.
Yeah.
Like a dupe.
You get to pick what you want to get rid of.
Yeah.
So that's another important thing. So it outs cards. Again, with the upstarts, you don't really care about the 1,000 life points because your guys are so big. But I like the aspect of it causing cards to miss timing and being able to actually select which card you're blowing up.
Yeah, I think it's valid. Again, does the 1,000 life points matter? Probably not. If you're running this and upstart, you might want to think about how many life points you're giving your opponent. Maybe swap an upstart for a Soul Taker.
I found myself boarding out 2 upstarts just about every game that I played. I boarded out 1 or 2.
In your post-tournament testing?
And yeah, just testing around.
Yeah. Last spell to consider. Twister is or Tornado, sorry. It's probably a very valid thought to swap one of the 2-sided Dust Tornadoes I have with a Twister, just because it's a spell that you can out Oppression or a field spell or defissure with on draw. Sometimes you really can't afford to wait. I think that's probably a valid enough mindset for me to perform that swap immediately. But up to you ultimately. Last card, both Skill Drain and Light Imprisoning Mirror actually are viable inclusions, but both of them screw Prisma in this format, which is very unfortunate. But it might be worth it for you to blank other strategies. This card blanks Frog Monarchs.
Yeah.
What do they have under Skill Drain? They have 2,400 beaters. You have 3,500 beaters under Skill Drain, and Ab-Zero at least.
Yeah, so the thought process is you ignore Gaia under Skill Drain.
Oh, you absolutely can't make Dark Gaia under Skill Drain. Just board out. You definitely board out Grand Mole, keep in Big Piece just because it's still Chungus under Skill Drain. It's a valid thought. I didn't opt for it. I cut that also the day before just because it had mixed testing. Sometimes you need your Caiuses to resolve. Sometimes you want Snowman Eater to resolve, or you want to keep Snowman Eater in, but it conflicts with this card, so...
If only Prisma sent for cost, just give me like 3 more months, man.
Yeah.
Give me 3 months.
But hopefully my ramblings weren't too much here. I wanted to kind of be exhaustive with both the deck, my thoughts about it, and my thoughts about it going forward. It was really fun to take a brand new deck into a competitive tournament and actually perform well with it. Top 24 is, I think, pretty good for a deck's first showing. Was luck on my side? I think at times, yes, and at times I got fucked. Oh, like that last game with first Frog Monarch.
Yeah, so Frog Monarchs, if summoning Dyna is very, very good against them turn 1. Unless they open Soul Exchange Vanity's feed, and you have nothing but Malicious feed and the Caius in your hand.
That was really good. But I hope you guys enjoyed watching the ins and outs of this deck. Feel free to ask questions. Feel free to hit us up. Happy to do more with this format and with Jank in general.
All right, thanks for watching, guys.